Hello, and welcome to today's episode of The Rundown. I'm your host, Skylar Budman, and boy, has it been a long time since we have done one of these episodes, but we are as excited as ever to be back. Things took a little bit of a turn, things got busy, but fortunately for you, the situation justifies the resurgence of The Rundown. So without further ado, let's get this started. This is an exclusive episode, something for our subscribers, and we will have additional content that will go out on Patreon as we keep this going. We're trying a little bit of a different format now to try and keep The Rundown going, and also to provide people with a little bit more exclusive content, a little bit more access to have discussions with members of The Rundown. But without further ado, we must keep the show going. Things are crazy right now in the United States. We just came from a whole swing of coronavirus. If I remember correctly, coronavirus pretty much justified shutting down the entire economy. It was one of these situations where the government came in. They decided everything needed to close in order to protect our health. That's something that we as citizens were unable to do at our own discretion. Given information, we weren't allowed to decide. The government had to come in and tell us what to do. But worry not, because coronavirus has seemingly fallen into the background. We have a new story, and this isn't really a developing story. It's kind of something that's been going on. As you could see, I guess this is to my left, right on the screen. Many of you might recognize this picture. His picture, this is George Floyd. His picture has been circulating around the internet for a while now. About a week now. This man was tragically killed by a police officer after the police officer placed his knee or had his knee pressed against the guy's neck. Mr. Floyd was pleading. He couldn't breathe, but the police officer continued in this manner. And I could go through the entire story, but most people do already know this story, and this is something you could look into on your own. But what's more important is what has come from this. So not only has COVID now become much less of a concern, but more importantly, we're seeing, sorry about that transition, we're seeing rioting to a degree that's, it's becoming absurd. Rioting is going on right now across the country as we speak. Earlier this evening, we saw in Oakland, there were protesters that stormed the highway. We've seen rioting going on in Minnesota, Minneapolis, where this has occurred. There have already been 3 police precincts that have been set ablaze. This is another photo from another one of these protests, and this was taken, I think, about 5 hours ago. I'm not even sure where. But, you know, the motivation behind coming back really was prompted by this. We have a situation that occurs. Somebody, a police officer, kills somebody else. And rather than looking at the situation as, well, a police officer acted entirely out of turn, this was inappropriate. He's clearly not properly trained. Him and the other police officers who were involved, they should be prosecuted. They should stand trial. And it seems like all the facts would point towards they should be convicted. Well, now we're seeing something a little bit different. This is actually being turned into a racial issue. So some of you might have seen this, and it's going to be a little bit difficult to see. And let me just see if I'm going to actually just blow this up on the entire screen, because I think it's extremely important that everybody sees this. So let me do this. But this is a chart right here, to the right of me, I guess. And this chart, what it shows is, and I'll tell you the exact name of the chart, but is death by police officers. So in the United States, police officers, and here I'm blowing it up huge so you can see it now. Boom, right in front of my face. So from left to right, we're looking at by different racial groups. I mean, this is just, it's terrible to see, from 2017 in blue, 2018 in black, 2019 in gray, and 2020, and keep in mind 2020, we're only 5 months into 2020, about to be 6 months in. These are people killed by police officers. And you're probably wondering, well, what is this segmented up into? So it's into categories. We have, this is in no particular order, Black people, Hispanic people, and then I think we have, there's one other racial group. There's unknown. There's a group for an unknown group. We have white people, and then the last group is other. So people who are not either Black, white, Hispanic, they fall into the other or the unknown category. So I wanted to put this up because people are talking about the atrocities being committed against certain groups, and I thought, well, why don't we actually illustrate this? I mean, we're talking about in 2017, this group all the way on the left, 457 deaths by police officers, shot to death by police officers. I mean, it's disgusting to even think that this is going on. And this chart actually comes with this little blurb at the bottom, and this is from the Statista Research Department. It's on statista.com, and this was published March 2020. So I guess it's from 3 months into the year, so we would see some additional numbers here. But data as of March 30th, 2020, pretty up-to-date data if you ask me. Now, this trend of fatal police shootings in the United States seems to only be increasing. That's what it says right here. 228 civilians have been shot, 31 of whom were Black. So notice that, 31 of whom were Black. So I'm going to pull up this next chart here so that everybody could see this. This is the chart actually with the labels. All the way on the left there, we're seeing white, then coming in, Black, Hispanic, other, and unknown. And I just think this should sink in for a minute here, because this is what we're really looking at. We're not looking at a chart that says Black people are killed more frequently by police officers. We're actually looking at a chart that says something a little bit different. We're seeing that even in 2020, it seems as if more white people have been shot to death by police officers. So I made the chart a little bit smaller because I think that kind of could sink in with you at this point. And I don't want to dwell on anything in particular, because some people might look at this and they'd say, well, Skylar, what point are you trying to make here? Should we be irate about what's going on with white people being shot to death by police officers? And I would say, well, why would we even categorize it in terms of race? Why is it that this has turned into a racial issue? So that's the question that I'm going to pose. I see a lot of people making some very interesting claims on social media, and that's really what the impetus is for me deciding to get back on the air. It's kind of that, I could sit by idly, I could listen to what people are saying, I could soak it in, I can internalize those thoughts, and I could just let it be. And I'm sure that a lot of you out there are doing this exactly. You're sitting there, you're looking at things going on the internet, and you're thinking, well, I could speak out, but if I do, I could be viewed perhaps as a racist. Somebody would say, well, you're not an African American person, you're not a Black person, you don't understand the plight of Black people. And I would never claim to understand the plight of actually anybody who isn't me, but I would challenge people to view this from a different lens, rather than saying the police are out to get Black people, the police are even out to get people. Why have we not reoriented this into what it is? Why is it that something occurs and now we have to respond by saying this is racially motivated? And a question that you should ask yourself is, would you respond this way if it was a Black officer who had done this to a Black person? Would you respond this way if it was a Black officer who had done this to a white person? Why even look at it through the lens of the race of the people? I mean, we're talking about a police officer, somebody who wields a significantly high amount of power in terms of society, versus a citizen, somebody who's really at the mercy of the police officer. When you're pulled over by a police officer, do you really think you're in a position to, as anybody, are you in a position to negotiate? I don't know if you've been pulled over for a traffic stop, for example. I could speak from experience. I've never been able to plead my case to a police officer and have the police officer say, I've never even attempted to plead my case to the police officer, in order to have the police officer perhaps drop the charges on the scene. Normally these officers they're people, they're imperfect, they're trained to do certain things. Obviously they make mistakes, and those mistakes should be met with a very realistic response. Perhaps we call for, well, police officers need more training, they need additional training. Is it bad to have policing in bad areas? Is it bad to have policing in general? I mean, certainly not, right? We would like to be protected. We don't necessarily want to have the burden of protection be on the citizens themselves. That's not a society that I would want to live in. Obviously, it's one thing to have the right to protect yourself. It's another thing to be entirely responsible for protecting yourself. I think it's good to have people who enforce the law. I would actually go as far as to say I think the majority of people who do enforce the law, the majority of police officers are good people, and they are serving the country in a capacity that the majority of us are not, because the majority of us are not police officers. And I think that's something that should be looked at as honorable. But obviously, honorable professions don't necessarily lead to only honorable people holding said professions. We hear about pastors or religious leaders all the time totally neglecting the trust of their congregation, going as far as sexually assaulting people. That's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. In some ways, people would argue sexually assaulting a child is just as bad as killing an innocent person, because you really do strip the innocence from the child, something that a child has to live with for the rest of their lives. We don't look at religious leaders as being all bad people when we see instances of this occurring. We also don't riot in the streets. We don't make it a racial issue, perhaps because it isn't. I think that's something that people need to consider. And I'm not here saying this police officer isn't racist. I actually don't know the police officer personally. He very well could be racist. He very well could have a deep, dark history of racism. But interestingly enough, I'm not seeing any of that being presented. I would say, why don't we as conservatives, as Democrats, and anybody who falls in between say, yeah, this is a bad situation. Police brutality is a bad thing. People who are police officers, they have a significant amount of power, and we should figure out a way to remedy whatever is going on, whatever causes any sort of indiscretion to be committed by a police officer. Now, is it going to be perfect? Certainly it's not going to be perfect. I mean, we do see a downward trend. If you look at this graph here that I have to the right of me, there's a very obvious downward trend insofar as police brutality, or not even police brutality, insofar as people being shot to death by police officers. Police officers haven't used deadly force. And let me add, by the way, this chart, and this is something that I want to clarify in anticipation of somebody making this point. This chart doesn't say whether somebody was wrongfully shot to death, right? Perhaps all but only a couple of people listed here actually required deadly force to be used. And my point is not to say, oh, well, police officers shouldn't use deadly force. And this isn't even to draw any sort of comparison. We do know that George Floyd was being arrested for forgery. I'm not exactly sure how that works. It obviously does not necessitate deadly force. But, we're talking about people who are killed by police officers. This is an ill of our society, something that we should aim to fix. And definitely something that I don't necessarily have the answer to. I have heard that police officers are being rushed through the academy in an effort to try and get more police officers on the street in order to prevent some areas that are under-policed from being in such disadvantageous positions and leaving the citizens of those areas to certainly fend for themselves or be subject to the law of that area created by the criminals who overrun it, or the criminal organizations who seem to overrun those areas. But it's a problem. It certainly is. Is it race related though? Really ask yourself, because I know a lot of people both on the left and the right, and I don't know a lot of people who I actually don't know anybody who's overtly racist. I don't know anyone personally who is overtly racist, and I also don't know anybody personally who tolerates overt racism. I, for one, do not. That has nothing to do with my view on whether Because keep in mind what conservatism is, right? It's strict adherence to the Constitution insofar as the role that government plays in our lives. That's generally what it is. If you read any documentation, the Constitution itself, and you talk to anybody who considers themselves to be a traditional conservative, the whole premise of the ideology is on the basis of the involvement of the government in our lives. And if I remember correctly, the left, Democrats, that's certainly what it comes down to as well. It's involvement of the government in our lives. So neither of those things have inherent racial or racist undertones. It's interesting that this is becoming a political thing. Anyway, this is just a quick exclusive with the rundown. We're going to get ourselves back started. I'm going to release this to as many people as I can. Obviously, let me know what you think, and I will also include the Patreon link. I'm going to start releasing more exclusive content. People will be able to view that. But for more things like this, we'll keep it free for now, and we'll start moving it to the subscription-based plan. Other than that, we're going to start getting some episodes of the rundown going on. We're going to start injecting some logic back in your lives. I think America needs it. With that, have a great rest of your evening. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, we'll catch you next time on The Rundown.